Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting to meet somebody that was introduced to me by a recent podcast guest, Bana Haffar. She pointed to this guy, and basically, her words, not mine, are, he's the shit, right? So I've always wanted to actually meet the shit, and apparently I'm getting to today. So with that, we'll talk to our guest for today, Anthony Baldino. Hey, Anthony, how's it going?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
I'm all right. Hey, thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to do this. I know it's you live a busy life, so I appreciate you taking the chance to do this.
Of course, man. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So why don't we kick this off? I did a little research on you, so I think I know all the things that you're involved in.
Okay.
But I would prefer if you would kind of define what you do. So why don't you kick this off by telling us what your work is?
I guess whenever people ask me this, I kind of split it into, quote, my day job and my personal music. But I guess my personal music kind of led me to the day job part. I do kind of weird, glitchy, down-tempo electronic stuff. And I used to do it kind of all field recording based until I fell down the modular, the Eurorack rabbit hole, which has just been an endless source of finding gold and things I wouldn't ever really come up with otherwise. So I guess lately I just do a lot of modular music and have been involved with the Los Angeles modular scene and modular on the spot. That all kind of led me to, when I first moved out to LA, I wanted to do film music. Mm-hmm. I had this notion, probably like a lot of other people, they're like, okay, I graduated school, I'm educated, and now I can just go out there and knock on someone's door and I'll have a job. And that got me as far as working at a liquor store.
Ooh. Okay.
Yeah. And it was one of those like very commercial, you must wear khakis and a collared shirt. And all the people who know me know I only wear black. So that was good times. Good times. So from there, I kind of made it my morning job of reading and answering any Craigslist post that said audio or mixing or sound design or film score. The first job I got from that was actually working for a good friend of mine now, Jerome Dillon, who used to be drummer in 9 Inch Nails, and did a lot of studio production with him and some film work. And then that chapter kind of came to a close, and I found this trailer company. And I found this post that just somebody wanted to buy some cinematic sound design. And I figured, well, I do weird electronic stuff. I can probably do that. And so the only thing I had to play them was this sound design contest I did that I had ended up winning. And so I sent them this really like heavy IDM glitchy track. And so they asked me to come in for a meeting, and I played again for the owner of the company and goes, you could probably do trailer music, which was news to me at the time.
Right.
I didn't even really ever consider the idea. Yeah, well, sure, I'll give that a shot. And it just ended up being a good fit. And everyone at that company now is a really good friend of mine. So I've just been working in the trailer world ever since, which, for anyone who does electronic stuff, it surprisingly lends itself really easy to that, because it's, you do have to have some musical background, but it seems like even if you're doing string stuff, they still want a serious level of weirdness along with it. So It lets me be weird and noisy and glitchy and take a lot of risks, which maybe I shouldn't do sometimes, because I'm sure I've lost a number of gigs because of that, but it was fun doing it anyway.
Well, I think most people who don't already know that this is a thing just kind of assume that the trailers use part of the movie soundtrack, but I would expect that in some cases the trailers have to go out long before the movie soundtrack is even nailed, right? I
think it just depends on the film. It depends on how they're doing the film and the approach and how much they have to record ahead of time. But yeah, I haven't worked on a single campaign that I know of that has used original music from the score.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, when I think of the music that I hear of for music trailers, I mean, first of all, you're right. There is kind of, it does seem to lend itself to the electronic music background from one standpoint is that it's actually almost more focused on, or it brings the sound design part to the front more so than the musical scoring part, right?
Absolutely.
So how difficult is it then to constantly be fresh with that?
Good question. I think one of the things that's always helped me when I first got into it, so the very first task or thing that was asked of me was to do up to 10 library cues.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, like, I think 2 months beforehand, my hard drive with all my samples just died. So no contact libraries, no nothing. And so I had a Zoom H4 recorder, and I just ended up recording tons and tons of sounds. And I think that's the way that always helps me stay fresh is like, of course, I'll keep all the sounds that I record, but for every single cue I do, find a new sound or a new palette that is your starting point for the cue. Just so it's almost like learning to write for a new instrument.
Right.
And, recording new stuff or trying out new modules always shifts the way you're going to approach writing a little bit, because you'll find that idea. It's like, oh, I never would have thought that. I know I've had sounds that made me write in odd time signatures that I typically don't gravitate towards, but because the sound just happened to be 13/8, that's the length of the bar, that I just did a track in that. And so it also helps you keep excited about it, which can be really difficult at times.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So, man, I have already about 50 questions, but before I go down that rabbit hole, one of the things I like doing in my podcast is I like talking to people about, how they got to be the artists they are. Now, you've kind of defined what happened for you from the time you got out to LA with stars in your eyes and, have become now this person doing this combination of your own personal music and trailer music. But what was the precursor to that? I mean, how did you grow up? How did you get to the point where you were both doing electronic stuff, but you were also, interested in sound design? What were your influences as you came up, and what were the things you did to sort of prepare yourself to going out to LA?
Prepared-wise, nothing. Big mistake. Literally moved out with a backpack and crashed on a buddy's floor for 4 months, which was supposed to only be 2 weeks, but...
Oh, man. You're that roommate.
That guy is one of my best friends, and I owe him for life. But getting into electronic stuff, when I was a kid growing up, I was playing in bands, and I played bass guitar in really terrible punk rock bands, and started getting into jazz a very little bit, and wanted to go to Berklee College of Music, and so I ended up getting in. I had this idea that I was going to major in film scoring, but also be a studio bass player, and that's the life I wanted to chase more, was like the more in the studio every day, playing on other people's tracks.
Right.
And all I really knew of at the time, I had this one Aphex Twin album, but I had these two roommates, and one of them was really into Radiohead and Bjork and Autechre, and the other one was really into heavy industrial stuff. So I really have those two guys to thank for kind of schooling me on electronic music. And then one day a buddy of mine told me I had to check out Telephone Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. I heard the first track off Fahrenheit Fair Enough, and that was it. I had to do that, or just do electronic music of some sort, because it was just the coolest thing I'd ever heard. It's funny, when people ask me what I'm listening to these days, I feel like that record, all their records, are still in my daily rotation.
Yeah, it's funny. I really recently did an interview with Josh Eustace, and it was
awesome.
I was actually really having trouble talking to him about his releases, because to me, Fahrenheit Fair Enough is, to me, still a recent album. For him, it's something he did ages ago. But for me, it's still sort of like this living music that's part of my, sort of like my daily cadence, because I listen to it so much. And I think there has been some electronic music that we've been lucky enough to experience that really does sort of like transcend the time frame of when it was done.
Oh yeah. I can see from his point of view, everything I've done even 6 years ago. I mean, there's some things that I'll listen to from 10 years ago. I'm like, wow, how did I do that? And then other things I listen to, I'm like, oof, I should just delete all of this. But that's just, you're your own worst critic times 8,000.
Right.
So
you went off to Berkeley, right? So what moved you? I mean, so these people kind of opened your ears up to electronics. How did you personally, though, make the transition? Did you, while you were in school, did you sort of say, I'm going to focus on the film thing? Or did you try gutting it out even after you found your ears changing?
I kept the film thing, so I still really like it. But they were both in the music synthesis program at the time, and I didn't even know that was a thing, to be honest. And so I dual majored, and I just got in and soaked up every little bit that I could. And it's funny, getting into it, I got much more into sampling and Max MSP, and because at the time they were focusing more on soft synths and like Native Instruments Complete with Massive and all that stuff.
Right.
And so my music would have, like electronic kick drums and other stuff, but would be heavily processed field recordings. And it wasn't really until I got my first modular synths that made me understand why they're so good and so magical and endless sources of creativity and content, which I always thought was funny. Like, I've kind of made this full shift. I still do some field recording, but I've made this full shift to modular synthesis, and that being my primary go-to for sounds. And even at this point, like compositionally, I'll start there a lot.
Well, that's pretty wild. So I just got back from a trip out to Berkeley. They had, I think that you would really appreciate where they've kind of gone with this. What was the synthesis department is now this thing called EPD, which is like electronic production and design, I think. And they actually put on the first of what looks like is going to be an ongoing conference called Voltage Connect. And it was
I heard about that.
Yeah, and it was really cool because it was very much about, synthesis of all sorts. And, they had Daniel Haver from Native Instruments do one of the keynotes and all that kind of stuff. But it was very focused on the modular as being a direction forward. And I thought that was pretty unique because I'd always thought of Berkeley as being really focused on being, turning you into sort of like an industry guy, right?
Yeah.
But it seemed like that group of people was more focused on, I don't know, opening doors or opening people's heads to be something more than that in some undefinable way. I just found it really interesting, and I thought it was a neat direction for them to go, if not necessarily, this step-by-step way to get a job in the industry. So it's interesting now that you've gotten so deeply into modular synths, and I'll tell you, I saw a picture of you that made me burst out laughing because, first of all, it showed you with your kind of a portion of your modular synth setup, and it was a Blackface ARP 2600, which I long had, and I don't anymore, but I miss it terribly, and a little tip-top case loaded up with some stuff, which is what I use. I use that exact same tip-top case. And I was like, okay, this is a guy I'm going to get along with really well.
I can't get over those cases. I now have 4 of those.
Of those little tip-top ones?
Yeah.
Aren't they amazing? I think if nothing else, the amount of design that went into making them is kind of inspirational to me.
Oh, yeah. Gur he's a madman. He is so smart.
Yeah. Well, and he's dedicated to doing the right thing, which is something I can always appreciate. So you have 4 of those. So I was just, in fact, seeing then a small part of your setup, right?
That was a long time ago, that photo.
Right.
And it just keeps on growing and growing and growing, which is a good problem to have, I guess,
Right.
We start running out of space.
Now, you talk about how you moved away from sampling, though, and are focusing on the modular as sort of a source of sonic development. I'm curious what that looks like. I mean, there's two things I kind of want to zero in on based on where we've gotten, and they're kind of parallel but not exactly. One of them is the concept of sound design, the way that you do it, where you have, different things, whether it's tensions or deep basses or whatever, that you need to generate for your work. But also this idea that you have this one track that's very like project focused, which is making these trailers musical bits, and then this personal development track where you're designing music that you're going to release or you're going to perform. And they're both kind of related, which is how do you doing this kind of design work, how do you go about it? Do you always have a goal, or do you sit down in front of like this big blank slate of modules and just start playing it until something captures your ear? Are you goal driven or are you inspiration driven?
I guess it depends on the deadline. Because for trailer stuff, sometimes I'll get requests that they want it the next day or in 3 days. And so for that, I still do use a lot of modular stuff. I'll always use a DPO for my kick drums to make tuned kick drums specific for that trailer. So it's still really fat, but in tune, and there's no deviation from the original sample, whether it be stretching or some sort of artifact from pitch shifting it.
Right.
Yeah, I guess for my own stuff, I approach it in two ways. Like, I'm just finishing up a track now where I was sitting down to start a different job. I've been doing some work with Dolby for some of their Atmos stuff, and I was sitting down to start a thing for them. And the idea that I had when I was walking up to the modular was very different from what ended up coming out. And I ended up just completely abandoning the work that I had to do that day because, you just find these things, you're like, oh, this is way too good to not record.
Right.
And then you're like, well, this is cool. Like, let me try patching this. And like, well, that's even cooler. And you just go down this long rabbit hole of patching stuff. And for me, that's also how I approach performing, which kind of lends itself to the same question of like, how do you approach writing? Is I'll get this giant, super busy patch going and then kind of figure out the orchestrate or the arrangement or kind of the choreography of being able to play it in time. Right. Yeah, just kind of break it down and then figure out the shape of it. So half the times it goes like that. And then for other stuff, maybe I'll start with like a piano part and just kind of get the shape of a track down and then start filling in. I'll do my kicks and then I'll do all my snares and sometimes layer the snares with like an R2600 noise snare plus finger snaps or magnolia leaves, like just dry leaves crunching, and just kind of go layer by layer and do more focused and finite production, if that makes any sense.
Sure. Well, what I always struggle with for myself, and maybe you have some clues on this, when I'm working on something that has a deadline or has a purpose, somehow I'm able to basically say, okay, it's done, right? It's either done because the clock tells me it's done, or it's done because somehow, I've used up whatever space I've been given, or I fulfilled something that gives me the sense that I'm done, right?
Right.
When I perform, I often start with, I don't come pre-patched, right? Instead, I sort of like make things up on the fly, which is really hard.
Wow.
And,
great man.
Oh, yeah. Well, it comes from having a system. I have just one of those tip-top cases, and it's been relatively the same for several years now. And so I really know it well, and I can kind of conjure things up. And I have ideas in my head, and also the way that the day goes will sort of inform me of what I'm going to end up with for a patch, right?
Right.
But when I'm trying to do like music for a quote release or music for that is meant to be some sort of artistic statement, I am stymied. I'm stymied because I never, first of all, I never know when done is done.
hmm The perpetual problem.
And then the second thing is, in every case, I can convince myself the next day that what I did was shit, right?
Oh yeah.
And so I'm going to ask you, because you actually, both from your day job and your own work, you have had to bridge these problems. What are the tricks that you play on yourself to allow you to call things done, call things good, call things suitable for release? What are the ways that you allow yourself to do that?
Oh man. Lately, I've been doing this, just kind of tricking myself. I got asked to demo for this one trailer for Wonder Woman, and I only had 3 days to do it. And I did it as fast as I could. And at the end of the 3 days, on the fourth day, I poured myself a cup of coffee and was like, let me go in the studio and listen to how bad that turned out, as we all do. And I sat there like, this is actually really good. Not tooting my own horn, and I rarely say that, but I'm saying that because, I only had 3 days to crank something out, and I could have done garbage, but I managed to do something that I think is really good. Why can't I do that with my own music? Why do I always feel like it needs to take a month and a half plus X amount of suffering to call a track done? So lately I've just kind of been trying to approach it as if a client called and said, you have a week to do this.
Mm-hmm.
So just tricking myself into okay, I have to sit down and I just have to do something and just start writing and let that guide me rather than stick to the idea. I walked in with this idea today and I have to make sure that this idea gets executed. Because I feel like a lot of times as any sort of artist, if you try and fulfill or make that idea reality, it's not going to be as good as it was in your head. So letting yourself stray a little bit, if not all the way, it is really beneficial, because then you'll do something that A, you didn't think you had in you, and B, you'll actually finish something.
Right. Yeah, that actually finishing thing is such a beatdown sometimes.
Oh yeah. And I've been having a conversation with a buddy of mine who does more pop-oriented stuff, and he's trying to finish up his first release, and we kind of talk about what if people don't like the single. And sometimes I think about it. I'm not really in the pop world, but I always wonder, well, is it you who actually gets to decide what's good, or is it someone else? It's like going back to the Josh Eustace thing. I think all of their work is solid gold, and hearing him rag on himself, so I was like, wait, what? No.
I know, right?
So yeah, that's what I'm struggling with too now. Is I'm getting a lot of modular tracks together to release and trying to let myself just let it go and let people decide what's good and what's not, or what is the best of my work, or the worst of my work. I don't know. Sure. Maybe it's all terrible. I think it also, doing this comes with a certain amount of letting yourself off the hook.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I've known people who have been just fearless about just, pooping stuff out and then feeling okay about the fact that it went out into the world. And I don't know, I envy them, and at the same time, I just can't even imagine what it takes to do that,
Oh, yeah.
So I have another question, because it's, again, all this stuff is kind of related just because it's popping up in my head as we're talking. One of the things that is, when we talk about trailer music, but if we also talk about modular music, what we tend to think of is things that have extremes, right? There's extreme frequency ranges at work, kind of extreme dynamics, extreme sound design, and a lot of times surprises built into the narrative of the tracks, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I wonder is, do you generally work at home, or do you work in a studio?
I have a studio at home, so
okay.
Work at home, yes.
All right. What kind of monitoring system do you use that's in any way useful for doing this combination of work? Because to me, when I go to a theater and I hear their big surround trailer tracks, um, it it's pretty overwhelming, and it's hard for me to imagine any kind of a home studio situation that actually can give you reasonable monitoring feedback on that stuff. What does your monitor setup look like?
Right now, I have ATC 25s, and those are paired with two subwoofer pros.
Okay.
So, and when I first got them, I knew I wanted the ATCs, but a few friends of mine started telling me I should look into doing a dual sub setup.
Uh-huh.
And I think a lot of us are, schooled to believe like you only need one sub or one sub is the appropriate thing. But I think for film, like you're saying, in theaters, there's a lot more going on than just one subwoofer. So I think the dual sub thing helps a lot because I'll tend to do weird things for trailers, like out of tune sine waves, like sub sine waves, but pan from left and right. So you get this weird, like physical,
like pulsing almost, right?
Yeah. It just is kind of odd. And so I also imported the Dark Knight scores and just put those into Pro Tools and watched it with an EQ on it with the analyzer on. And it was really surprising to me to see the amount of stereo sub that they had in it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I figured there had to be something to it. So that's what I'm using to monitor. And the ATCs the response is super linear. So like if you listen really quiet, you get the same frequency response as you do when it's really loud. So that helps me in at least the confidence department of knowing that it's going to translate.
Yeah, well, it's funny because this dual sub thing keeps on coming up. My friend Ron a long time ago was like, it's really something you have to consider, and I was like, well, I think it sounds ridiculous because that's not the way sound is supposed to work, right? But it definitely it seems to, if nothing else, it certainly cleans up anomalies that you might have in your room. It seems to help that a bunch. But now, so you said you have the ATC 25s. Those are like some jaw-droppingly expensive monitors. Is it for you? Is that just like, hey, this is one of the tools of the trade, and I just have to buy into it?
Yes, no. I've been up until last year. I was mixing on Yamaha HS80s, and I still love those speakers. I think for that price range, they're really, really good speakers. But I just felt I pushed them as far as I could, and no matter what, I'd always hear something wrong.
Right.
When I took them to a buddy's house, or if it played in the theater, or so I just wanted to get to a point where if there was something wrong, it was because I was doing it wrong and not because I couldn't hear it.
Got it.
So I saved, obviously, for a little bit and pulled the trigger on the ATCs.
Right. Pretty happy with them, I bet, huh?
Oh, yeah. Getting used to them was and still is a bit of a challenge. And that is one thing, as soon as I got them, I was like, if I could give 20-year-old me advice, it would be to invest in better speakers way earlier, because your ear just gets so used to how a different speaker works. And then when you buy in later, we're all really busy. So like you don't want to be taking time away from the creative part of your day to make sure you're doing things correctly on a new set of speakers. But
right.
Yeah, the clarity in them is just unbelievable. And I can't tell you how many records I put up just to listen to in the morning and like, oh wow, I never heard that synth part or never heard that little sound design floating. And it would be like a record I've listened to for 12 years.
Right.
So Yeah, I really love them.
I'm gonna have to start saving up my box tops for something like that because that sounds like a winning turn. So
Do
now,
it.
oh, thank you, Satan. You can get off my shoulder now. So, one of the things you said is you've moved kind of from sampling into really being focused on using the modular stuff. Do you still find yourself doing like a lot of sampling of the modular in order to make it convenient to work with in terms of arrangement, or are you still pretty oriented towards going from the modular and spilling it directly to a mix?
I lean towards staying modular. You know, sometimes if time allows, I'll write with like just some soft synth and then use a MIDI to CD converter.
Mm-hmm.
And just, you know, if I'm writing the bass part, I'll just use a sine wave just to get the part down so my ear isn't attached to a specific sound later. And then take the MIDI out and convert it to CD and then just start tweaking on the modular and find something cool and record that in. I have, for trailer work, I have a folder of different bass sounds that I can just put in the contact real quick, or patches that I've saved that I know will work. Because sometimes you just don't have the time to like do all the fun parts.
Well, and there are some like really iconic sounds that are used in trailers that aren't really even used anywhere else in the real world, right? There's that like big sub impact sound, and there are like the big huge drops and the huge rises and stuff that are sort of particular to that kind of work. And so I would imagine that, you know, a certain amount of your arsenal is just things that you've developed over time that are in your tool belt. And, you know, sometimes you need a screwdriver, so you have to pull out the screwdriver, right?
This is true.
So in terms of your DAW and stuff, what do you tend towards for doing this work? And or is there stuff that you're kind of required to use? Are you compelled to like provide Pro Tools sessions or anything like that?
All the people I work with just require stems, like a full mix and stems. So DAW doesn't really matter. I always used Logic up until actually this month. I just started trying to make the shift to Pro Tools.
Oh, wow.
Another learning curve in my life.
Why would you use Pro Tools on the creative end? Does it drive you in a specific direction, or is it like I sometimes play around with changing stuff up just to make it so that my reliable crutches are no longer there, right?
Yeah, I think for sound design stuff, for me, it's been a lot faster. Granted, I haven't given Logic X a chance yet, and I heard they just did their version of Audio Suite, but having Audio Suite has been phenomenal. And the other thing, too, that I'm really loving about Pro Tools is one of the most simple parts of mixing, and it's just the panning in it is actual true panning. And in Logic, it's if you're panning something right, it's just turning the volume on the left channel down. So you're not moving the information that's in the left speaker to the right, which has always been really frustrating because, I mean, obviously it's not accurate, but having to put on a plugin to swap the stereo image just to get something, you know, the one or two extra steps to do a workaround that seems like a no-brainer that should be there before you start implementing other things into your software. So mostly for cleaner mixing is the reason why I was drawn to it. Because all my friends who use it, just the spatialization and the headroom that they have just always seems, it just sounds so good. And I'm always like, why is it that I can't do that? So,
well, it's interesting that you say that because I certainly do notice the different sounds in mixes from different DAWs, right?
Yeah.
I mean, conceivably, once you mix to a stereo track set or a mix of stems or whatever, you shouldn't really be able to notice it. If, you know, whatever decisions you made should transcend the software, right? But that's not true. And I never really spent the time analyzing like the panning functions, but certainly there is something about Pro Tools mixing that seems to be clean. Seems to be cleaner. I always assumed that it was just when I work in Logic, I feel like I'm pushed into using more plugins than I normally would, right? There's something about that environment that draws me into like throwing yet another log on the fire, right? And where definitely that doesn't feel like the case in Pro Tools, and so I just assumed it was that, but I never really thought to examine the raw, pure tools of like basic planning and level management. That's interesting.
Yeah, it just seems cleaner, and like the things that I always wanted to hear, I can now achieve.
Right.
So
That's pretty cool. So you're just starting on that then, huh?
yeah, just dove in this month.
Wow. Well, good luck. I'll check in with you next time out in L.A. I'm going to stop by and just check in with you, find out how's that's going, because
Yeah, please do.
that seems like a very interesting thing to do. Do you end up using MIDI very much then? You mentioned sometimes, very quickly using it for sketching out ideas, but your interaction between like Pro Tools and your modular system, are you piping MIDI back and forth, or are you doing live stuff and just sort of capturing it on Pro Tools, sort of like an extended tape deck paradigm?
For the most part, it's functioning as a tape machine for personal work, but for trailer stuff, I definitely use a lot of MIDI.
Interesting.
Because you need the 11 million layers of drum tracks and, string samples and choir samples and
Right.
all the samples.
How much time do you have to spend just like tracking down this week's new stack of sample libraries? I ended up, for some reason, I got, I think it was producer loops, maybe. I think I was looking for like hand drum samples, and I bought some like $4 pack of samples off of them. And now I'm on their mailing list, which every week informs me of like the 50 new sample libraries that have come out in the subsequent week.
Man.
Right? It's
Yeah.
shocking. There's just like an amazing assortment of stuff coming out every single week. How much do you feel like it's your job to stay on top of what's coming out, what's current in the sample world?
If I am supposed to be doing that, I'm doing a terrible job doing that.
Oh no.
But I think it kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier on how do you keep the idea fresh. Is like,
Right.
I kind of have my go-to orchestral things that I know work, especially for the way that I write, but I don't have a single, that's not true. I think I did one purely orchestral track. But most of my stuff, just because of the way I write, is always really synth or sound design heavy. So I think a lot of the new, instead of using something that I sampled from the modular last year, coming up with something new kind of replaces, for me, having to have a new sample bank.
Right.
And if it is electronic drums or stuff, I've always been from the school of making them myself. I kind of always, it's funny when I first heard that the first Telephone Tel Aviv record, knowing that they made all their own stuff, or made some of it. I don't know actually how much they made, but I just assumed that everybody made their own kick drums and their own snares. So I just got into this practice of...
That was part of the work, right?
Yeah. So I know a lot of people, and a few people that I work with on trailers, whenever they see me go over to the modular and flip it on, it's just, no, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. And they'd rather just snag a sample or something really fast. But for me, it takes me longer to sift through samples and find the sample than just make something. So.
Yeah, the complexity of going through huge lists of sounds is it's kind of a creativity killer, I think, too. You end up just...
Yeah.
Because inevitably you're just like, I'm effing done looking at this list of crap, and I'm just going to grab this thing because it's close enough. But once you do that, then all of a sudden you also find out that now it's actually more problematic to tweak it to be what you wanted, and you just end up giving up. And that giving up process, that is sort of a creativity killer for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
So do you think that that the modular is kind of the ultimate in the creativity line for you, or do you think that you might end up going back and exploring sampling again, or do you think that there's something else that you might get into, or does modular feel like the terminal point of what your, I don't know what to say, what your instrument's going to be?
I think the modular will always kind of be my instrument, not my primary instrument, but it's interesting. Because I still sample stuff and we'll put it in the modular. There's modules that, you can just put a bunch of one shots in and run through your drum sounds, or put a 2-minute whatever you want. There's a 2-minute drone, 2-minute field recording. So I'll definitely still be sampling stuff because it is really fun. It's just, I guess it's also ease of use, whereas I can just turn around and walk over to my modular rig versus like getting out of Los Angeles and finding somewhere quiet enough to go record, I think that's kind of one thing that's held me back is just where I live.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, there's lots of stuff to be recorded, but I've always found it challenging trying to find that thing to record. So.
Sure. The other thing I think is, and who knows, maybe there's going to be a future where somebody's going to make a sampler that has 200 knobs on it. Because there's something about the immediacy of having a modular and patching the things you want, but then you tweak it not by adjusting numbers, but by grabbing a knob and turning it until it not only sounds right, but like feels right.
Yeah.
And the lack of any sampler that can do that is kind of the thing that I think is a beatdown in working with samples.
Yeah. I think especially once you've kind of caught the Euro rack bug or the modular bug, it's just so pleasing and so instant gratification where, I've had a number of times where I've been messing with samples and turns into something really cool, but then there's the other times where it's just hours of tweaking before you come to the realization that this just isn't working.
Right.
And I need to press delete and start over.
Yeah, right.
So.
Right. So now one of the things I'm curious about, because I got a chance to listen to some of your work on SoundCloud, and I'm going to strongly recommend for the listeners to do the same because it's really beautiful work.
Thank you.
But how do you translate that into a live environment? So like I know you've done the modular on the spot thing with Eric and Bana and that crew. How do you take something that's as layer driven and cinematic as your recorded work and translate that to a live environment, especially one where maybe a computer's not even invited to the party?
I think it's just nature of the beast having limited tools. It's going to be a little bit different, and I'll choose to do different things, but a lot of the glitchy stuff I still incorporate in my live performances, and I think some of the kind of softer, like reverb-drenched piano type things, I'll put into the Qubit Nebula and play that through, like my Strymon pedal or through clouds, and just kind of recycle that or use it to regenerate new parts, almost like remixing,
Sure.
like live remixing, which is always fun because it gives an extended life to your older work.
Right. Do you ever use looper pedals, or do you ever do looping as part of that work?
I don't. I've tried really hard to get into pedals, but I don't know. I have a hard time with it. So
right.
I basically just stick to my Strymon, and that's it at this point.
Interesting.
I mean, I'd love to try other pedals. I guess that's something I should do diligence on, is just going to Big City Music and trying out every pedal, because I get frustrated quickly sometimes and just be like, this one pedal is stupid, so all pedals are stupid. Don't quote me on that. But, I think the big thing that gets me really at the end of the day is like, I love the modular stuff because it's all in one enclosure.
Right.
So to have a bunch of other kind of scattered things, I'm really making this sound bad for myself, aren't I?
No.
Pedals.
Quite frankly, I completely agree. Because one of the things that I found in putting together my system is there's certain things I did not want outside of the box. I wanted it so that I could flip open, and maybe it's the allure of that tip-top case, right? Which you flip it open and it feels like a thing. It feels like I just opened my lunchbox, right? And I'm getting ready to get on it, right? And I don't want to say, okay, I'm going to flip that open, and I have these 3 electron boxes I have to set up, and I have to wire everything across, and oh yeah, I've got my chaos pad, and I've got my blue sky pedal, and next thing I know, I'm mentally saying, a laptop with some plugins would be a whole lot easier, right?
Yeah.
There's something about flipping open that case and just saying it's all right here, and I can just live inside this little world. I kind of really like that.
Oh, totally. And the other thing too for me is, so once you get a reverb module or something like a delay like the Echophone, you get so spoiled being able to have CV control over everything. So like you can be focusing on your drum pattern while you have a bunch of LFOs, like an extra set of hands tweaking your delay module.
Right.
And then just having like that versus a delay pedal or a reverb pedal, which still sounds really good, but it no longer feels like a part of the piece to me.
Well, I certainly feel that way about delays. I mean, because if nothing else, like CV modulating the delay time, there's so much stuff you get to do when you allow yourself to do that, but you're never going to do it with a pedal. It's just never going to work because if nothing else, you can't get tweaky enough with it, right? And so, I completely agree. Well, cool. It makes a lot of sense, and I can, I have a sense for how you work, which is kind of interesting because, again, listening to your work, I was like, man, you go places that I don't even know. I don't really understand completely, right? So it's interesting to kind of hear where your head is at and how you sort of develop these things. It's really cool.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So with that, I've more than used up my time already. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to do this. One last question before we go. Let's assume that someone's listening to this podcast. They're working in a liquor store with their khakis on, and they're wondering how they're going to kick off their sound design career. What are some of the things that you would suggest that they focus on or put some effort behind? What are the things that can really help people not necessarily get a job as much as put together their personal voice?
Good question. I don't know that I have a good answer, but I don't know. I think staying away from samples has always helped me. Just trying to create everything from scratch always seems like a good way. If you want to have sound design, heavy music, seems like a good way, almost a natural way of finding your own voice, because that way you're going to gravitate towards the sounds that you like and that naturally affect and inspire the music you're going to write. So, whether it's getting like a little Zoom recorder or starting a modular rig, or if you prefer, another tool that I think a lot of people forget about is Reactor, which I think is amazing. Like whenever I visit my folks, I always have my laptop and I'm just trying to build and learn more about Reactor, because it's like having a modular system just on your laptop.
Right.
So I think learning to build things and learning how things work, because that's made me significantly faster when it comes to doing trailer music. This needs to be really sound design heavy and really weird. I've already made plenty of weird stuff, most of it unusable, but at least I know you almost teach yourself what to reach for first, opposed to like, I need to make this exact sound, or I've made this exact sound. It's almost like knowing which tool to reach for or which direction to start walking down that will lead you to the end goal. I don't know if any of that's helpful, but...
No, I think it is, because one of the things it does is it points to something that no one talks about, which is so often plugins or music software or whatever is just chock full of presets. And the thing is, stepping through the presets doesn't teach you anything. It gives you a way to get some music onto a track, but it doesn't you aren't learning anything in the process. And I think what you're talking about is that sort of like the quest to understand is probably more important than the gear you have or the education you have or whatever. That quest and having the hunger to learn that stuff is what really ends up helping you find your own space.
I agree completely. And I definitely agree with it really doesn't matter what gear you have. You can always do something cool with
Right.
just a single tool or a few tools. I always hate hearing people say, like, well, I need to get this thing and this other thing before I can
Then
start
I'll be
doing
able to
the
get
other
started.
thing.
Right. Then I can get
Yeah,
started.
it's like,
right.
if that's what you really, really need, then by all means do it. But there's always something to be done. You know, even if you just focus on doing something ultra ambient that day, it doesn't have to be your grand opus, but just start making music.
Anthony, I want to thank you so much for your time. This has been has been really fun to talk, and to get your insights on things, to get some of your vision for how this stuff happens. It was really awesome to talk to you.
Yeah, same here. I really appreciate this, man.
Yeah, no worries. And next time I'm out there, we're going to hang out, all right?
Yeah, you are welcome anytime. The door's always open.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. And we'll talk again soon. Bye now.
Sounds like a plan.
Thanks for Anthony for the great chat. It was really interesting to hear of how he approaches both his personal music as well as his work creating movie trailers. Really interesting stuff. And it's really fun to hear from a guy who, when he first thinks of a sound, the first thing he does is turn to a modular. Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate it. I appreciate each one of you tuning in to these weekly podcasts. And with that, I'm going to sign off for this week. Catch you next time around. Bye.